coming in the door.
Okay.
Heavens, you certainly have an admirable boomerang collection.
Pshaw. No better than any other tortoise. And now would you like to step into the parlor?
Fine. I see you also have a large collection of records. What sort of music do you enjoy?
Sebastian Bach isn't so bad in my opinion, but these days, I must say, I'm developing more and more of an interest in a rather specialized sort of music.
Tell me, what kind of music is that?
A type of music which you are most unlikely to have heard of. I call it music to break phonographs by.
Did you say to break phonographs by? That is a curious concept. I can just see you, sledgehammer in hand, whacking one phonograph after another to pieces to the strains of Beethoven's heroic masterpiece, Wellington's Victory.
That's not quite what this music is about. However, you might find its true nature just as intriguing. Perhaps I should give you a brief description of it.
Exactly what I was thinking.
Okay. Relatively few people are acquainted with it. It all began when my friend the crab, you've met him, by the way, paid me a visit.
'Twould be a pleasure to make his acquaintance, I'm sure. Though I've heard so much about him, I've never met him.
Sooner or later, I'll get the two of you together. You hit it off splendidly. Perhaps we could meet at random in the park one day.
Capital suggestion. I'll be looking forward to it. But you were going to tell me about your weird music to smash phonographs by, weren't you?
Yes. Well, you see, the crab came over to visit the other day. You must understand that he always had a weakness for fancy gadgets, and this time he was quite an aficionado for, of all things, record players. He had just bought his first record player, and being somewhat gullible, believed every word the salesman had told him about it, in particular that it was capable of reproducing any and all sounds. In short, he was convinced that it was a perfect phonograph.
Naturally. I suppose you disagreed.
True, but he would hear nothing of my arguments. He staunchly maintained that any sound, whatever, was reproducible on his machine. Since I couldn't convince him of the contrary, I left it at that. But not long after, I returned the visit, taking with me a record of a song which I had myself composed. The song was called I Cannot Be Played on a Record Player One.
Rather unusual. Was it a present for the crab?
Absolutely. I suggested that we listen to it on his new phonograph, and he was very glad to oblige me. So he put it on, but unfortunately, after only a few notes, the record player began vibrating rather severely, and then with a loud pop, broke into a large number of fairly small pieces scattered all over the room. The record was utterly destroyed also, needless to say.
Calamitous blow for the poor fellow, I'd say. What was the matter with his record player?
Really, there was nothing the matter, nothing at all. It simply couldn't reproduce the sounds on the record which I had bought him, because they were sounds that would make it vibrate and break.
Odd, isn't it? I mean, I thought it was a perfect phonograph. That's what the salesman told him, after all.
Surely, Achilles, you don't believe everything that a salesman tells you. Are you as naive as the crab?
The crab was naive by far. I know the salesmen are notorious prevaricators. I wasn't born yesterday.
In that case, maybe you can imagine that this particular salesman had somewhat exaggerated the quality of the crab's piece of equipment. Perhaps it was indeed less than perfect and could not reproduce every possible sound.
Perhaps that is an explanation, but there's no explanation for the amazing coincidence that your record had those very sounds on it.
Unless they got put there deliberately. You see, before returning to the crab's visit, I went to the store where the crab had bought his machine and inquired as to the make. Having ascertained that, I sent off to the manufacturers for descriptions of its design. After receiving by return mail, I analyzed the entire construction of the phonograph and discovered a certain set of sounds which, if they were produced anywhere in the vicinity, would set the device to shaking and eventually falling apart.
Nasty fellow. You needn't spell out for me the last details. That you recorded those sounds yourself and offered the dastardly item as a gift.
Clever devil. You jumped ahead of the story, but that wasn't the end of the adventure by any means. For the crab did not believe that his record player was at fault. He was quite stubborn. So he went out and bought a new record player, this one even more expensive, and this time the salesman promised to give him double his money back in case the crab found a sound which it could not reproduce exactly. So the crab told me excitedly about his new model, and I promised to come over and see it.
Tell me if I'm wrong. I bet that before you did, you once again wrote the manufacturer and composed a record and recorded a new song called I Cannot Be Played on Record Player 2 based on the construction of the new model.
Utterly brilliant deduction, Achilles. You quite got the spirit.
So what happened this time?
As you might expect, precisely the same thing. The phonograph fell into innumerable pieces, and the record was shattered.
Consequently, the crab finally became convinced that there can be no such thing as a perfect record player.
Rather surprisingly, that's not quite what happened. He was sure that the next model up would fill the bill, and having twice the money,
I have an idea. He could have easily outwitted you by obtaining a low-fidelity phonograph, one that was not capable of reproducing the sounds which would destroy it. In that way, he would avoid your trick.
surely, but that would defeat the original purpose, namely, to have a phonograph which could reproduce any sound whatsoever, even its own self-breaking sound, which is, of course, impossible.
That's true. I see the dilemma now. If any record player, say record player X, is sufficiently high fidelity, then when it attempts to play the song I Cannot Be Played on record player X, it will create just those vibrations which will cause it to break, so it fails to be perfect. And yet, the only way to get around that trickery, namely for record player X to be of lower fidelity, even more directly ensures that it's not perfect. Seems that every record player is vulnerable to one or the other of these frailties, and hence all the record players are defective.
I don't see why you call them defective. It is simply an inherent fact about record players that they can't do all that you might wish them to be able to do. But if there is a defect anywhere, it is not in them, but in your expectations of what they should be able to do. And the crab was just full of such unrealistic expectations.
Compassion for the crab overwhelms me. High fidelity or low fidelity, he loses either way.
And so our little game went on like this for a few more rounds, and eventually our friend tried to become very smart. He got wind of the principle upon which I was basing my own records and decided to try to outfox me. He wrote to the phonograph makers and described a device of his own invention, which they built to specification. He called it Record Player Omega. It was considerably more sophisticated than any ordinary record player.
Let me guess how. Did it have no moving parts, or was it made of cotton, or...
Let me tell you instead. That'll save some time. In the first place, Record Player Omega incorporated a television camera whose purpose it was to scan any record before playing it. This camera was hooked up to a small built-in computer which would determine exactly the nature of the sounds by looking at the groove patterns.
Yeah, so far so good, but what could Record Player Omega do with this information?
By elaborate calculation, its little computer figured out what effects the sounds would have upon its phonograph. If it deduced that the sounds were such that they would cause the machine in its present configuration to break, then it did something very clever. Old Omega contained a device which could disassemble large parts of its phonograph subunit and rebuild them in new ways so that it could, in effect, change its own structure. If the sounds were dangerous, a new configuration was chosen, one to which the sounds would pose the threat, and this new configuration would then be built by rebuilding the subunit under direction of the little computer. Only after this rebuilding operation would record player Omega attempt to play the record?
Aha! That must have spelled the end of your tricks. I bet you were a little disappointed.
Curious that you should think so. Hey, I don't suppose you've heard of of Gödel's incompleteness theorem backwards and forward, do you?
No whose theorem? Backwards and forward? I've never heard of anything that sounds like that. I'm sure it's fascinating, but I'd rather hear more about the music to break records by. It's an amusing little story. Actually, I guess I can fill in the end. Obviously, there was no point in going on, and so you sheepishly admitted defeat. And that was that. Isn't that exactly it?
What? It's almost midnight. I'm afraid it's my bedtime. I'd love to talk some more, but really, I'm growing quite sleepy.
As am I. Well, I'll be on my way. How silly of me. I almost forgot. I brought you a little present. Here.
Thank you. Really, you should have. Why, thank you very much indeed. I think I'll open it at once. It's a quite exquisite goblet. Did you know I'm quite an aficionado for, of all things, glass goblets?
Didn't have the foggiest. What an agreeable coincidence.
Say, if you can keep a secret, I'll let you in on something. I'm trying to find a perfect goblet, one having no defects of any sort in its shape. Wouldn't it be something if this goblet, let's call it G, were the one? Tell me, where did you come across goblet G?
Sorry, but that's my little secret. But you might like to know who its maker is.
Pray tell me, who is it?
Ever hear of the famous glassblower Johann Sebastian Bach? Well, he wasn't exactly famous for glassblowing, but he dabbled at the art as a hobby, though hardly a soul knows it, and this is his last goblet in the last piece he blew.
Literally his last one? My gracious, if it truly was made by Bach, its value is inestimable. But how are you sure of its maker?
Look at the inscription on the inside. Do you see where the letters B, A, C, H have been etched?
Yeah, sure enough. What an extraordinary thing. Let me put this on my shelf. By the way, did you know that each of the letters in Bach's name is the name of a musical note?
Isn't possible, is it? After all, musical notes only go from A to G.
Just so in most countries, that's the case. But in Germany, Bach's own homeland, the convention has always been similar, except that what we call a B, they call an H, and what we call a B flat, they call a B. For instance, we talk about Bach's Mass in B minor, whereas they talk about H more Messa. Is that clear?
I guess so. It's a little confusing. H is B and B is B flat. I suppose his name actually constitutes a melody then.
Strange, but true. In fact, he worked that melody subtly into one of his most elaborate musical pieces, namely the final contrapunctus and his Art of the Fugue. It was the last fugue Bach ever wrote. When I heard it for the first time, I had no idea how it would end. Suddenly, without warning, it broke off, and then dead silence. I realized immediately that was where Bach died. It is an indescribable sad moment, and the effect it had on me was shattering. In any case, BACH is the last theme of the fugue. It is hidden inside the piece. Bach didn't point it out explicitly. But if you know about it, you can find it without much trouble. There are so many clever ways of hiding things in music.
Or in poems. Poets used to do a very similar thing, though it's rather out of style these days. For instance, Lewis Carroll often hid words and names in the first letters of or characters of the successive lines in poems he wrote. Poems which conceal messages that were called acrostics.
Bach, too, occasionally wrote acrostics, which isn't surprising. After all, counterpoint and acrostics, with their levels of hidden meaning, have quite a bit in common. Most acrostics, however, have only one hidden level, but there's no reason that one couldn't make it a double-decker, an acrostic on top of an acrostic, or one could make a contra-acrostic, where the initial letters taken in reverse order form a message. Heavens, there's no end to the possibilities inherent in the form. Moreover, It's not limited to poets. Anyone could write acrostics, even dialogicians.
Dial a logician? That's a new one on me.
Correction, I said dialogicians, by which I mean a writer of dialogues. Something just occurred to me. In the unlikely event that a dialogician should write a contrapuntal acrostic in homage to J.S. Bach, do you suppose it would be more proper for him to acrostically embed his own name or that of Bach? Well, why worry about such frivolous matters? Anybody who wanted to write such a piece could make up his own mind. Now, getting back to Bach's melodic name, did you know that the melody BACH, if played upside down and backwards, is exactly the same as the original?
How can anything be played upside down? Backwards, I can see. You get HCAB. But upside down, you must be pulling my leg.
On my word, you're quite a skeptic, aren't you? Well, I guess I'll have to give you a demonstration. Let me just go and fetch my fiddle. Okay, here's my fiddle. And play it for you forwards and backwards, every which way. Let's see now. Here's the last contrapunctus in the art of the fugue, and here's the last theme.